Hello everybody and welcome back. I apologize for there not being any videos last week. However, I was super sick and was not up to recording. So we're back and we're doing something new. I'm kind of excited about it. This is not something unique to my channel or me. This is super common on BookTube, and I have been watching some videos trying to get some ideas. And I can't really credit anyone specifically because it seems like literally every channel does this sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know who to credit for it being the original person to think of this, but it's called a wrap-up video, and it just goes over some books that I've read recently. And instead of a full-blown deconstruction of the book and the different elements and everything, it's just a really quick rapid fire of, I read this book, here's a 1-minute summary of the plot, and here's my thoughts about it. So that's what's really different. Is I still am not going to be giving any recommendations because I have no idea what your preferences are. However, I'm going to be giving my opinion instead of just a kind of clinical dissection of the book. So if you end up having taste that's super similar to mine, you might find these useful. Or if you're just interested in the sort of things I really like in books, you'll get to know me a little bit better. So without further ado, the first book I want to talk about is A Rewind Files by Willett. This took me by surprise. I found this book in the most random way. The author went on a Twitter rant about something random, it doesn't matter, and somebody I follow on Twitter liked the Twitter rant, and so it popped up in my Twitter feed, and I was reading what she said, and I was like, this is really intriguing. And then she gets through this whole rant, and she's like, it would now be a good time to mention that I wrote a book. And so I went to Goodreads and read the synopsis, and it sounded really interesting, so I was like, sure, I'd like to read that. It's the Rewind Files, and the premise is that it's the year 2112, so roughly 100 years in the future. They have discovered some way to go back and manipulate time. And as soon as this was discovered, a bunch of people went back and tried to fix major atrocities in history, Hitler and that whole genocide, and I can't remember specifically what they listed, but so a bunch of scientists went back, or historians or whoever went back and tried to right these massive wrongs, and it ended up annihilating the time stream basically. And so now what they have to do is, when they're sensing anomalies in the timeline of what it should be, they go back and kind of nudge it back into where it's supposed to be. So she ends up, my dog really wants to play. So the main character, whose name I've literally already forgotten, ends up going back to 1972 because there's a major spike that they're sensing around the Nixon election, his re-election, I believe. And they end up discovering that this anomaly is actually not something that someone did on accident trying to fix some major atrocity. This was done intentionally by some sort of mole or spy or whatever in their time agency, which is basically the FBI of time, I guess. So there's this major conspiracy that she's trying to unravel, and it ends up, this thing that's intentionally done causes World War III, and 56 million people die. So apparently that war was never supposed to happen, they discover, and they are trying to undo the work that this mole has done to cause this war. So she has a weekend basically to go back into 1972, figure out who's doing what and stop it, otherwise World War III happens and 56 million people die. So it sounds a little bit clinical, a little bit heavy on the science part, the way I'm describing it, but basically it's kind of like a Mission Impossible movie through time instead of across Europe or whatever. It was so good. So good. It was great because there was history involved, but it's alternate history. So it wasn't really dry because you're seeing all these things that are almost real, but not quite. They're off just a little bit. And it's like nonstop action, and it's this really great mystery. Like, truly, it's a mystery. You have no idea who's doing this, why they would want to do it, and the main character is really witty. So I really enjoyed watching her brain work, and it was not only a journey of through time trying to fix this problem, but it's a journey of self-discovery for her. She's a desk agent, she's not a field agent, but she's thrown into it because she's like the one that spotted this anomaly and realized that there was some sort of mole working. So they're like, well, you're the only person we really trust because you're the only person that has ever brought this to our attention. And so she's like, I don't want to be in the field. This is not my thing. I have no people skills. I am like a mathematician. I am good behind a computer desk. Like, and so it's a journey of her trying to figure out like who she really is, what kind of skills she actually has, how she interacts with the people around her. And I loved everything about this book. So like I said, I'm not going to recommend it because I don't know if that's your thing or not, but if it sounds interesting, I really enjoyed it and thought it was really well written. So there you go. The next book I want to talk about is Renegades by Marissa Meyer. Yeah. Now, Marissa Meyer wrote a series that I really enjoyed called The Lunar Chronicles, and it is, I didn't look it up, but it's 5 or 6 books, and they are all futuristic retellings of classic fairy tales. I really enjoyed that series. The Renegades is the first of, I think it's supposed to be a trilogy, and it's set in, I don't know if it's actually supposed to be the, like, actual future, or if it's supposed to be like an alternative now type of thing. They never really say, but basically there are people, it's kind of like X-Men, where there are people who start having special abilities and they are persecuted because people are afraid of them. So there's this guy called Ace Anarchy who basically rises up and does away with through rebellion, does away with the government, because he was they call them prodigies. He was a prodigy and didn't like seeing his people persecuted and hunted and that sort of thing. So he thought the best way for that to be handled was for anarchy to be the way of the world. And so he does away with the government, but when he does, these gangs rise up and basically annihilate everything. It ends up being this like war zone, more or less, and a whole bunch of people starve to death, and it's terrible. So then a bunch of prodigies become superheroes, but they're like vigilante superheroes because at this point there's no government, and they end up taking down the anarchists. And this is all backstory for this. So they end up taking down the anarchists and rise to power and basically are starting to put everything together, or back together. So they create their own government based around prodigies, basically, and superheroes. So the government is run by superheroes. They're actually called superheroes. And the book starts with, so that's like the preface, more or less. So the book starts with the niece of Ace Anarchy trying to figure out ways to take down the superheroes. She is bitter about them and the promises they've made that they didn't fulfill, and all sorts of stuff that I don't want to spoil for you. I mean, it's all in the first couple of chapters, but it's more detail than you really need. So she decides to go undercover in the Renegades. The Renegades is the name of the superhero government, and try and take them down from the inside. So it's supposed to be a trilogy. This one is basically setting up the clash between the Renegades and the anarchists. I had some issues with this book. Now, it's young adult, and I am most definitely solidly just adult. So I think part of the issue is I read a lot of young adult books, and for a lot of them, I can't, like, if you didn't tell me, hey, this is a young adult book, and nowhere specifically was it like, and the protagonist is 17, would I have been able to tell, like, this is a young adult book? A lot of times it's young adult purely because they label the main character as like late teens. This one, I definitely felt like I was not in the targeted age bracket. And so I had a kind of a hard time reading it. There's a lot of exacerbated, overly emotional scenes. And there's a lot of decisions made where the decision that is actually come to doesn't actually make any sense other than it just being like a super emotional decision, which frustrates me because it's like, well, this clearly isn't going to go well. We realize that this is just a plot point that you're doing to further the book along. And so a lot of it just felt really forced. And this book is doing really well on Goodreads, and all of the other booktubers I've heard talk about it just raved. So I don't know if I'm just too old, and I enjoyed the general story. I just felt like it was really tedious getting to the end. So I will probably read the other books, but I was kind of disappointed. Yeah. The next book that I read was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. I don't know if I said that right or not. Now, this is originally written in Portuguese. The author is from Brazil. And the one that I read was translated by Alan R. Clarke. So I don't know if this has been translated multiple times, but that is the specific translation that I read. I went into this book with so much hope. So many people had told me, I read this book and it changed my life. I read this book. It was so beautiful. It was amazing. And it changed my life. I was like, oh, cool. I didn't really know what it was about because that was just what people were telling me. Like every person I know that had read it was like, I read this book. It's amazing. It's beautiful. You have to read it. It changed my life. I was like, okay. And I didn't really like it. It is beautifully written. I can't fault the writing. The thing is that it's very esoteric. And I'm okay with that to a certain degree, but it basically was like a theology book where it was like, let me give you a couple of lines of like 7 different religions and mash them together and kind of create my own, but make it sound like it's valid from all these different religions that I'm actually drawing on, while actually kind of bastardizing all of the religions that I'm drawing on. And as a religious person, that really bothered me, like a lot. And so I didn't really it was basically like if you took Bible verses and wove them together in a way that turned it into like Aladdin. It was really weird. It was super weird. And the theme of the book is follow your dreams, and absolutely no matter what, the universe will conspire to make sure it happens. And as someone who has done a bunch of stuff to try and follow her dreams and it has not panned out, I did not really appreciate that speech either, because being told like if you work hard enough you can make anything happen is not an accurate thing. Like some stuff is just not going to happen, and maybe this is a bit of a downer, but literally like magic happens. This kid ends up talking to like the sun, and the sun like does stuff for him because he's trying to, since you're pursuing your dreams, so I don't know. It's beautifully told. And if you're just reading it for pure, like, I want a beautifully written story and I want, something that's easy to read because it's only like 180 pages or something. It was a very easy read. It's kind of boring, in my personal opinion, because I was like, it was not at all what I was expecting, and I just found it kind of boring because it's very preachy, but it's beautifully written. Yeah, this is a super unpopular opinion, I'm pretty sure, because literally everyone I know that's read that book thinks it's like the best book they've ever read. So yeah, not a fan. The next book that I read is Girl Waits with Gun by Amy Stewart. It is, I could not verify this anywhere, but on, I think it was the Goodreads page, or maybe it's Amazon description. Somewhere I read that it's described as being a like fictional retelling of New Jersey's first female detective. And I tried to do some research about that, and I could not verify that this woman actually existed anywhere. So I don't know if this is just, they're saying if this was real, she would have been New Jersey's first female detective. I'm not sure. But the first book takes place in 1914 and 1915. So over 100 years ago in New Jersey. And the main character is the oldest of three sisters who are living alone. Their parents are gone, and their brother, who's older than them, has married and moved out of the house. So it's three sisters by themselves. And I read this book at kind of an interesting time. While I read this book, the Kavanaugh Senate hearing thing, whatever you want to call it, was going on. And it was really difficult to listen. I did an audiobook for this one, but to listen to the way women were marginalized back then, not just by men, but by women as well. It was a very good book. And had it been any other week, I would have been like, yeah, I really enjoyed this. But literally, they're talking about how women, I mean, they didn't phrase it this way, but they go on like not tyrants, on rants, how basically the only thing women are good for is their virginity and for popping out babies and keeping up a household once they're married. Like, that's it. Now, the point of the book is the main character kind of thumbs her nose at that and is like, screw that. I don't want to get married. I don't want to be owned by a man. I don't, I just want to live my life, and I'm going to find a way to make that happen. And the entire book, people are like, you girls, she's literally in her mid-30s, the oldest sister, who's the one telling this story. She's in her mid-30s, and not once are they referred to as women. They are referred to as girls. The entire book. They're like, you girls shouldn't be out there on that farm by yourselves. How can you possibly take care of yourselves without a man? How are you going to take care of yourselves without a man? And it was so hard to listen to. No, and again, this is not an issue with the book. I feel like this is probably fairly accurate to how things were back then. But it's so hard to hear repeatedly through this book, especially given what was going on this week. So I thought this book was really well done. The characters are very, very lifelike. You have a clear image of all of them in your heads, and by the end of the book, she does find a way to make it work and becomes the first woman detective in New Jersey history, and that is a victory. It was really hard to get to that part. Really good book. I will definitely be reading more in the series. And there will be, once I've read more, a review for it coming up at some point. And finally, the last book I want to talk about today is The Chocolate Chip Cookie Murder by Joanne Fluke. This is a cozy mystery series. There's like 20 books in the series. There's a bunch. And this is the very first one. The premise is this woman owns a bakery in some tiny little town in Michigan or Minnesota. One of those two. I can't remember. And her brother-in-law is a beat cop in the police department and is trying to get promoted to detective. And there's a murder in town. So he ropes her in to try and help him solve this mystery because he feels like if he can solve this murder, he'll get the promotion to detective. I was really disappointed in this book, and I don't know if it was actually a fault of the book. So here's the deal. I was a police dispatcher for 10 years, and so I worked for a police department for 10 years with officers every day, and the idea of an officer being like, hey, can you solve this murder for me while I'm out doing whatever? Because he at no part is actually doing anything to help with this mystery being solved at all. She literally does everything, including she figures out suspects and then goes and interrogates them herself. Instead of being like, hey, I found this lead, maybe you should go follow up on it. Like, at no point does she involve him. And at no point does he actually do any of the work himself. And I just found it so ludicrous. And I'm not saying I'm expecting it to be like a police procedural that follows accurately to what it would be like, but the idea of her being sanctioned to go out and do the investigation on her own on behalf of her brother-in-law, who actually works for the police department, was so ridiculous. And at no point does anyone in the town figure out what she's doing, even though she's like actively interrogating people and like breaking into houses to look for clues at night. And yeah, and she's not very clever. I think I probably could have overlooked it if she was really clever, but I felt like stuff was really, really obvious, and she was still like, and so you're having to go through like 20 more pages of her trying to put stuff together that you've already put together, and that's not interesting to me. And at no point was there like a real big plot twist or anything. Like, I knew who the murderer was, so when it was revealed and the main character was taken by surprise, I was not. It was not a plot twist, so I just at no point was really like gripped by the mystery or anything. It was her driving around handing bags of cookies to people and being like, hey, so what did you hear? And I don't know. Like I said, I was underwhelmed. I read reviews of this book, and a lot of people said the first one is not the best. It gets significantly better in the second and third books. So I will be reading the second and third books before I do an actual review of this series, but I was very underwhelmed by the first one. The real winner in the bunch of these books was The Rewind Files. That's probably the best book I've read in a couple of years. It was so good. I was shocked. And then Girl Waits with Gun was also very good. But the other three, I was just like... So I will be doing reviews, like full, like, dissections of some of these. The Alchemist, I feel like I've said everything I need to say on. So there won't be anything for that. But stay tuned if you wanted to hear more about the other books to get a better handle on if it's something you want to read or not. But until next time, happy reading. Hello, everybody. And... oh, cattail. 10 seconds into the video. Let's see. Stop! Okay, let's try this again. So we're back, and we're doing something different, something new. He really wants to be on my lap. Excuse you, dog. 1800th time is the charm. This is too much information. Like I said, maybe I'm just too old.